Welcome to another episode of our Inside Interviews podcast. Today we are pleased to have Professor Robert Gleave joining us from the United Kingdom, from England. Robert Gleave is a professor of Arabic Studies in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter. He researches the history of Shīʿī law with a particular interest in legal hermeneutics. He has led international projects linked to these themes and currently leads the SDIL project, Schooling and Deschooling Islamic Law, funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. He's the author of Inevitable Doubt, Two Shīʿī Theories of Jurisprudence, Scripturalist Islam, the History and Doctrines of the Akhbārī Shīʿī School, and Islam and Literalism, Literal Meaning and Interpretation in Islamic Legal Theory. His most recent collaborative publications are with Kumail Rajani, Shiite Legal Theory, Sources and Commentaries, and with Omar Anchassi, Islamic Law in Context, a primary source reader. It is perhaps not an understatement to state that in the field of Islamic law and Shiite studies, Professor Gleave is a mainstay, so to speak. So we are so happy to have you. Thank you, Dr. Gleave, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Let's begin by just telling us a little bit about your history in Islamic studies and Shiite studies, in your academic background.
Yeah, I was very lucky to have some inspirational teachers who focused on Shiism and then a bit later specifically on Shiite law. So I was taught by my professor of politics when I was doing my undergraduate degree at the University of York, was a lady called Hali Afshar. She was an Iranian who worked a lot on Islam and feminism, but also specifically on Islam in Iran. And from a Shiite background, she inspired first my interest, if you like, in Shiism. And she recommended me to go and often learn some Arabic and do a master's in Islamic studies, which I did at the University of Manchester. And there I was taught by someone called Norman Calder. And Norman Calder, who did my MA dissertation supervision and then my PhD supervision, he was one of the people, I think, that really put Shiite legal studies on the map. His PhD thesis was one of the first detailed studies of Shiite law, and he was recognized as having made a major contribution to the history of Shiite law. And he was a great teacher. Both of them were just fantastic teachers. And I often say that if I'd have had a great teacher in the history of Chinese religion or in the history of Buddhism or whatever, I may well have turned out to be someone who focused their academic efforts on Buddhism. Mm-hmm. I had two great teachers who worked on Shiism, and the result was that I wanted to study with them, but more importantly, they inspired a real interest in the history of Shiism for me. So you end up doing a PhD in aspects of Shiite law, and then you've got to get a job. And the jobs in Shiite studies they don't really exist. Specifically in Shīʿī studies, they don't really exist. So I took a job in teaching Islamic studies at the University of Bristol in the UK, and I taught there for 10 years. I was in the Department of Religion, so I was the only person teaching Islamic studies there. That is a steep learning. You learn a lot through having to teach everything about Islam from the time of the Prophet right up to what happened yesterday in Afghanistan. You have to cover all of that area, and you become able to navigate your way around the sources in all of these different areas. But Shiism, even though I had to teach on a whole range of different things, Shiism remained the main focus of my research and the main focus of my interests in terms of, what texts I was reading, what preparations I was doing for publications, and ultimately what books that I wrote and published. It was all geared around my interest in Shiism. So I was very fortunate to have two great teachers, but I was also very fortunate that I got a job which gave me the opportunity to carry on that work and that obsession, if you like, before I ended up in Exeter. And that was in 2005 that I moved from Bristol to Exeter. So I've been in Exeter 20 years, and I was in Bristol 10 years, so I've been 30 years in the game, which is a long time, a long time, longer than I thought it was going to be when I started, but it's great. No, I've really enjoyed it. So that's sort of my story of how I ended up focusing on Shiite studies.
And there's no doubt that your books and your articles, you know, some of which we have here today, are really important. You know, just because Shiite studies is so understudied, and you've, I think, been able to cast a light on a subject that is otherwise perceived largely through geopolitical lenses. And you've talked about that in your previous work, and I wanted to come to that. When we think of the word Shiism, we often ask, let's say someone in religious studies, or just even someone off the street, you know, who are Shias? Often, in my experience, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, you know, images of some kind of militancy or revolution is usually conjured up in their mind, not this 1,400-year-old tradition or 1,000-year tradition of intellectual thought and discourse and debate. And what was it like for you? I mean, you were writing about Shiism or Shia thought or the Shia school of thought and its interaction with other Muslims 30 years ago.
Yeah. There were very few of us studying Shiism per se, you know, 30 years ago when I was doing my PhD. There were very few of us. There weren't that many people doing Islamic studies generally. You know, this was before 9/11, and 9/11 was a wake-up call for a lot of universities that they needed to start incorporating Islam more seriously into their curricula. So I was working in the pre-9/11 period when Islamic studies was viewed as part of the overall, you know, curriculum of religious studies that we should be teaching, but it wasn't given any particular prominence. And Shiite studies was even more a smaller element of Islamic studies, even than it is today. So it was quite difficult to persuade people that what you were doing was important. Other elements of people working in Islamic studies had a bit of an easier ride trying to demonstrate that what they did was relevant and important. I mean, I always used to try and argue that, you know, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a huge event. But if you want to understand the intellectual forces which led to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, you have to understand Shiism. Because in many ways, the Iranian Revolution was an Islamic revolution, but it was also a peculiarly Shiite event in the Iranian context. So you want to understand that, you've got to go back in time. And you've got to go back, you know, over 1,000 years to try and understand how Shiism has developed. And that's the way in which you sold your subject area, is to say that, you know, you have these things going on in the contemporary world. But if you want to really understand the historical context for these events, then you have to go back in time. And therefore, what we do is worthwhile. You know, when I'm studying the 13th century or the 14th century, or, you know, events which happened during the Safavid period in Iran or elsewhere in the Shi'i world, you understand what's happening today as part of a long story, a long history. And I think that is one of the things which slowly has begun to become part of the curricula in universities now, that's not quite as marginal as it used to be. And I've been very lucky in that the institutions I've worked for have been very supportive, even though, you know, they don't know what Shiism is as an institution. It's not really something which figures on their radar, but they are supportive and they recognize that this is work that needs to be done. So I've been very lucky from that perspective. But the wider field, those of us that work in Shiism, we're still, a minority, and that's not a surprise. But we're not just a minority. We're sort of we've experienced a sort of life as an academic footnote. Let's put it that way. Shia studies has experienced life as an academic footnote, in which people have said, of course there are Shiites, but I'm not going to deal with them. Because my main focus is always going to be Sunni Islam, because that's the majority. So I think that's beginning to change, but it's a slow process. And in the beginning, it was very much, we were on the margins. Those of us that study Shiism were on the margins of Islamic studies, which in itself was on the margins of the academic world generally.
Yeah. And the the formation of the Shia Research Institute, right, which is we're housed at the University of Toronto, for some people was seen maybe as being slightly I don't know what to say, how to describe it, but overtly Shiite by having the word Shia in the name itself. Yeah. And this was a discussion, what name do we give this research institution, this academic institution? And I think personally, including the word Shia in it is important.
Yes, well, I mean,
but this is a debate, right?
Yeah, it is a debate in the field, and it's a debate. Those of us that work in Shiism is, shall we or should we sell ourselves, should we promote ourselves as people who do Shiite studies or just Islamic studies? Now, there have been organisations in the past which, although they are focusing on Shiism, and they can be community organisations and they can be academic organisations, but they describe themselves in more neutral terms as just the Institute of Islamic Studies for this or that, or Muslim studies of this or that, because they say that, and this is the argument, it's not a weak argument, but it's one which we must take note of, is because they say we want people to recognise Shiites as Muslims, because that's our first battle, if you like, within the Muslim community and to the outside world. The first battle is to try and get people to recognise Shiites as Muslims. So we call ourselves the Islamic Institute of this or the Muslim Institute of that. That's one point of view. Against that, you could say, we've reached the point now in the field where, only the most fringe groups are trying to say that Shiites aren't Muslims, all right? So, there's not... The mainstream of Islamic studies has accepted the fact that the story of Shiism is part of the story of Islam. So that's no longer an issue. Now we think to ourselves, is it worth making the focus to say that the Shia tradition, because of its neglect in Western scholarship over the past 50, 60 years, because of that neglect, we need sort of like a institutes or programs of study which actually focus on Shiism and demonstrate the rich tradition, intellectual tradition of Shiism, partly in order to depoliticize it, but also to demonstrate its contribution, if you like, to Muslim civilization over the centuries. So it's, there may be tactics involved to an extent. University life sometimes is a bit political, and if you want to get yourself noticed, sometimes you have to do one course of action rather than another. And in some circumstances, I think that it's only right and proper that we make the point that Shiite studies has been neglected, and therefore we need dedicated programs which tell the story of the Shiite contribution to Islamic civilization. And then in other circumstances, it may be that it's more appropriate for us to talk in a broader Islamic context in which Shiism is part of the story of the overall story of Islam in a less focused way. And I think, you need to work out which context you do this and which context you do that. But I'm not wholly in one group rather than another. And I think that we're not yet at the stage where we can say that Shiism will be part of any curriculum in Islamic studies anywhere in a university in Europe and North America, let alone the rest of the world. We're not at that point yet. So we still need, if you like, dedicated institutes which push a particular perspective, because the job's not done yet. Even though we've made strides in the 30 years that I've been doing this job, the job's not done yet in terms of Shiism being the natural, being a natural part, if you like, of any Islamic studies program.
I mean, right here in Toronto, right, we have one of the largest universities in North America, the University of Toronto, about 90,000 students. Religious and Islamic studies is taught across multiple faculties: philosophy, historical studies, religious studies, Near Eastern civilizations, divinity. That's just what I can think off the top of my head. Now imagine all these departments have faculties. So there's a lot of people that are working on Islam at this university. Probably one of the largest consortiums in North America. The number of professors that are actively working on Shi'i-related projects is perhaps one or two.
Yes.
In a massive institution.
Yes.
Like that. Why is that? I mean, geopolitically, Shiism is so exciting right now. I mean, it's never been as exciting. There's wars breaking out. I mean, I'm not relishing in that at all. I mean, obviously, but it's something
you'd think that was reflected in some academic focus. You know, you'd think
and not simply on the political science side.
No, but these
something beyond the political science.
Yes.
Or the military strategy.
I mean, the truth of the matter is that in our field, in terms of Shiite thought, the history of Shiite, the intellectual history of Shiism, let's say, it takes, you can't just click your fingers and everything changes overnight, because we haven't got the skills, we haven't got if you like, we haven't got the personnel available in the field to be able to give Shiite studies its due within a big institution like the University of Toronto. So one of the issues is that we've still got scholars coming up through the ranks, a significant number of scholars coming up through the ranks who are going to be able to populate the field in the future. So that's one thing, is that in the past, there was a shortage of expertise in Shiism who could also teach in a university context. So that was one issue. But it wasn't just about that. It was also that when I started out, if you did Shiism as your main focus, then you were really seen as doing something which was marginal and strange and not the mainstream of Islamic studies. So getting a job was actually quite difficult. This is why I say I've been extremely lucky to work in institutions which have supported me, even though I studied something which was, marginal or a minority pursuit within Islamic studies generally. So a lot of people, students had to be strategic. They had to think to themselves, I've got to write a PhD. I've got to write a PhD which is going to give me the best chance of getting a tenured job or a tenure track job at the end of the PhD. Writing one on Shiism or an aspect of Shiism may not be the smartest move in the old days. I don't think that's the case anymore, but it was the case 30 years ago. And if you're talking about populating the field with expertise, then it takes 30 years. So that's another reason why I think that we're short of people. But I think that there's a sort of chicken and egg situation with that unless there are people in the field doing Shiite studies, they're not going to get hired. Yeah. And universities aren't going to recognize the importance of the subject area unless they recognize that there's a body of people, a body of scholarship which records its contribution. So, the truth of the matter is that most people, like going back to what you said earlier, most people, when they think about Islam, they don't think about Shiism as part of the story. Their other images come into their head when they think about Islam and Islamic civilization. So, all of those factors combine to mean that Shiite studies as a discipline has actually had quite a tough time over over my academic lifetime. I've seen a lot of changes, and I see some positive developments. I mean, a Shia research institute 30 years ago would have been unthinkable. Not because that Shiites didn't exist or they weren't important, it was that it would be unthinkable for an institution to put its weight behind that sort of project. That has changed. So, and that can only be a good thing for the field.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree. And there's so many, like you said, people coming up through the ranks now who will contribute. And going back to the Shiite story, or the story of Shiism, let's get to Islamic law a little bit.
Right.
And clearly an area that is your focus. Is there such a thing as Shīʿī law?
Well, yeah, I mean, you speak with people who study
Nobody
Shia
calls it Sunni law, do they? No. They just call it Islamic law,
yes,
right?
that is part of the problem. Well, there's two things.
And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, well, there's two things, really. There's one which is there a field of study which we can say, in an academic sense, is Shiite law? And secondly, is there such a thing as Shiite law? Those, in a sense, are two separate questions. Yeah. I would say, focusing on the first one, the academic study of Shiite law has received minimal attention over the past 100, 150 years that Western academia has been looking at Islamic law generally. So when Shiite contributions to the history of Islamic law were studied, they were extremely minor, like I said, as footnotes and as an oddity, as a strange, marginal, unusual, eccentric tradition, which we don't need to worry too much about. If we want to understand Islamic law, we don't really need to understand Shiite law. And that was certainly the case up until the 1970s in the field of Islamic law, and maybe a bit longer than that. And some of the most eminent people in the field, when they've written their introductions to Islamic law, one aspect or another of Islamic law, many of those books are excellent and they make a major contribution to the field, don't cover any element of the Shiite tradition in terms of legal understanding. Whereas those of us that work in the field know what a body of scholarship this represents over a 1,000-year period in terms of Shiites who have written about the law, and in terms of fiqh, or in terms of usul, and in terms of fatawa which have been made, in terms of other supporting sciences, which we think of ilm al-rijal, or we think of tafsir, or any of these supporting sciences. From a lawyer's perspective, you draw on those sources. When you look at the body of scholarship, it's enormous. I mean, huge, with thousands of books that have been written. But they hardly get referenced in general introductions to Islamic law or elements of Islamic law. So that is the frustration that I found with the field when I started, and it's still a frustration I have with the field, is that many people who are leading figures in the field, they really view Shiite laws as terra incognita. They can't go there. They don't understand it. They don't feel they have the background, or they don't feel it's important enough to actually figure in their overall story. I'm aiming to stop that. And I'm aiming to say that, when you study Islamic law, you study Shiite law as part of that story, because at every stage of the development of Islamic law, Shiite scholars have had something interesting to say. So, I don't want to plug my own books, but those of you that know some of the work that I've been doing will know that sort of like the Islam and Literalism book.
Yeah.
In that book, I blend the legal theory of Sunni writers and Shiite writers into a single narrative around the particular topic, which is about the hermeneutics of literal meaning. Yeah. So you blend these things together with ideas coming in from the different traditions, and you get a richer picture, if you like. Similarly, on another level, with the textbook which I've done with Omar Anchassi, in that book, Islamic Law in Context, yep. which you kindly have brought a copy of along here, Islamic Law in Context, Omar and I made a conscious decision that we're not going to focus on particular texts from particular traditions to translate into English. We're going to represent the full range of Islamic experience, and that means that there are texts from Shiites, as well as texts from Sunnis, as well as texts from Ibadis, all different traditions. We feel, we were trying to be completely, academically speaking, non-sectarian. Yeah. In the sense that all of these traditions have had something positive to contribute to the history of Islamic law, and so we want to reflect them in the book. So you find the book is, a mixture of texts from different traditions. You pick up many books on Islamic law in terms of the academic literature, and they may have a grand title which talks about the Islamic law of this or the Islamic law of that, or studies in Islamic law in this way or that way. You look at the contents, you will see virtually nothing on Shiism, and you look at the index, and you won't even see an index reference to Shiism. And that is a problem with the field. The problem with the field is that Shiite legal studies has not managed to impress itself on the field as powerfully as it should, and the field has not been as receptive, if you like, to the idea that outside of the four Sunni schools there is a world of Islamic law which goes on, and the field is focused very much on understanding the four Sunni schools and the Shiite schools, or other schools of thought as well, the Ibadis and everything else. It's just like marginal and outside the worldview. We're trying to change that, and I think we've made some influence. And the way in which I've had to do it, and not just myself, but many others in the field, is you've got to make connections. You've got to demonstrate how what Shiites are doing in an area of the law is not strange or bizarre or eccentric or from another planet. It's part of the same mechanism, part of the same story, if you like, of how Islamic law is made real in people's lives. Just as it is for Sunnis, so it is for Shiites. So you've got to try and make those connections between the Shiite tradition and the other traditions in order to demonstrate the contribution of the Shiite tradition. And we've made some, as I said, we made some progress. We're not there yet, but it's really been a driving force of my work in the field has been to try and rectify this imbalance which I perceived, and I think I've said this in print, so I'm not ashamed to say it on a podcast. I think that the field was influenced by the sectarian dynamics within Islam, which in the late 20th century and early 21st century has been very polarized politically. And I think that in some ways the field, with its focus on Sunni law, has sort of unconsciously inherited a privilege for Sunni law over other forms of Islamic legal discussion. And it doesn't realize it's done it sometimes. It does it unthinkingly, but it has happened, and that's why Shiite law has not got the attention it deserves.
On that same note, let's go to the first 3 centuries or 4 centuries of Islam. Did it look like that?
Well, I think that the truth of the matter is all of the studies...
During the formative period?
Yeah, in the
first
formative
300 to 400 years?
In the
of
formative
Islam?
period, the situation was much less... I don't like to use the word sectarian, but it was much more mixed. There was much more cross-fertilization, if you like, between the different traditions. That whilst the Shi'i legal tradition was developing and growing up, not just from the imams themselves, but also from the followers of the imams and people who elaborated on the imams' legal teaching, there was cross-fertilization and cross-pollination with others who weren't necessarily students of the imams or weren't from a Shi'i perspective, also doing legal studies. That they were part of the same discourse and they shared lots and lots of ideas and they had debates. Sunnis had debates within themselves as well as debates with the Shia, and the Shia had debates within themselves, legal debates within themselves as well as debates with Sunnis. Debating was one of the ways in which, you know, ideas were passed from one group to another or between different individual scholars. Shi'i studies were studying with Sunni scholars and Sunni scholars were studying with Shi'i studies, the scholars. There wasn't the sort of, we think of it today, because our communities quite often live separate lives. Yeah. We think that maybe in those days the scholars of that time lived separate lives. They didn't. They were part of an overall melee of intellectual exchange, and the early texts demonstrate that. Having said that, the scholarship on that early period is only slowly beginning to recognize that it's not just a story of how the four Sunni madhabs came into being. A lot of Islamic legal scholarship has sort of like studied the formative period in order to explain how Islam came to be what it was in what they sometimes call the classical period. So the formative period was formative for what? It was the formative for the four-school system. You know, from a Shiite historical perspective, the formative period was not formative for the four-school system. It was one stage in the overall development of the Shi'i contribution. So it's actually you take on you look at the early period through the Shiite lens, you see it very differently. You know, when Malik was teaching in Medina, he didn't think to himself, I'm the beginning of the Maliki school. Okay? He didn't think to himself that. He thought he was just a teacher. And, you know, he shared classes with Ja'far as-Sadiq. You know, Ja'far as-Sadiq famously said that he loved Malik. He thought, you know, he was great. So, you know, these scholars were not living in separate worlds. They were living in part of the same intellectual space. And they weren't thinking to themselves, oh, one day we'll have four schools of law. They weren't thinking that at all. You've got to be able to study the period in the context of the period. And the context of the period was one of intellectual exchange in which these labels of Shi'i law or Sunni law had not yet emerged as significant. So I think that's one of the areas of research which I think we've got a lot to do on. As Islamic legal scholars, we've got a lot to do on. But also, there are some lessons for our scholarship today about don't allow later schemes of compartmentalization influence the way in which you study the early period, because it has done. A lot of the scholarship has been focused on how do we explain the formation of the four Sunni schools, rather than how do we explain the development of Islamic law in all of its different manifestations. And that is one of the things which I think we need to change in the field, and one of the things which Shiite studies can really do to just sort of prod the field to move more meaningfully in these new directions. And that's some of the things, when I've written about the early period of Shiite law, that's some of the things which I've tried to do. is to try and say that, the connections, if you like, between what we call Shiite legal texts from the early period and contemporary texts, which we call from the Sunni tradition, really illustrate the exchange that I'm talking about here. There's so much crossover and shared material that to speak of distinct, separate traditions is meaningless when we're talking about the early period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that especially when we go to look at the early sources, right, whether it be the Rijal, legal texts, fiqh texts, I think it also requires a good knowledge of those sources, of those early Arabic sources, which often Shiite sources are just not consulted very often, right?
That's been
early
one of the
Shiite fiqh, hadith, Kulayni, Rijal, and if you dive deep into this, you'll see incredible conversation. Oh wow, this is an interesting conversation. Oh, this demonstrates this demonstrates this, but I think it first requires an awareness of all that other literature that's there. It requires it to be present in the mind of a researcher. That why don't I look up this particular issue in, let's say, Kulayni's Al-Kafi or Saduq's work or some of the Rijal works, whatever it is, these formative sources, and I may see things that are relevant to me as a non-Shiite studies specialist.
Yes, I think in Islamic legal studies generally, we are still living, rightly or wrongly, in the shadow of the influence of the scholars from some of the scholars from the 1950s and 60s and 70s, whose focus was very much on what we call the Sunni tradition and explaining the existence and current and later developments of the Sunni tradition by reference to the early period. So a lot of the scholars who studied Islamic law in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and contributed to our discipline really only looked at Sunni sources. Perhaps the most glaring example of this is a very influential work by Joseph Schacht called The Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, which you can love it or you hate it, but its contribution as a landmark study in the field is indisputable. It brought a whole new way of looking at Islamic legal studies, and we're all sort of reacting to it in one way or another, positively or negatively. But one of the things which was present in Schacht's work, in The Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, was a major work of many hundreds of pages. In terms of devotion to Shīʿī topics, there's like 5 or 6 pages in a chapter at the very end of the whole book, as if Shiism was not part of the story, if you like, of the development of Islam. And now, his attitude, the way in which he categorized Shiite sources as essentially unreliable, so they can't tell us about the development of Islamic law because first of all, they're a bit later than the Sunni sources and they're unreliable. A lot of them were fabricated in order to justify earlier positions that the Shiites claimed that they held, as they're quite obviously late. And he focused very much on those areas of Shiite law in which the Shiites held what he considered to be eccentric and strange doctrines that weren't in tune with the Sunni doctrines. So inevitably he had something on whether you wash or wipe your feet during prayer, like a big polemical issue between Sunnis and Shias. He had a section on mut'a marriage. Anyone that talks about Shiite law has to have a section on mut'a marriage.
All the hot topics.
Yeah. Well, it's as if Shiite law is nothing more than whether you wash and wipe your feet and mut'a marriage. Whereas we know that those are only one elements, if you like, of the. So Schacht's mechanism for talking about Shiite law was around its strange doctrines, the doctrines which set it apart, if you like, from the mainstream, as he saw it, rather than looking at the areas where it had shared material with the mainstream, where it was part of the conversation with the mainstream, where Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq had something to say, and the contacts which he had with Malik and Abu Hanifa in terms of the formation of Islamic law. So, you know, we live in the shadow of that sort of scholarship, not just Shacht, but a number of people that worked on that area who really, you know, if they talked about Shiite law at all, it was relegated to a small chapter at the end of the book. Yeah. You know, when we've done all the main stuff, then there's these strange people and we'll do a chapter on them. We're gradually, I think, beginning to reform that methodological approach, such that people are beginning to integrate more and more Shiite sources into their general account of particular elements of Islamic law. But there's still a sort of dominance within the field, if you like, of the study of the Sunni sources, which means that there's still work to be done in terms of the history of early Islamic law and an integrated account of how Islamic law developed, how it came into being, how we ended up with the systems that we know of in the contemporary period. What is their historical genealogy? That has to come through a more generous attitude towards early Islamic sources.
Sheikh al-Mufid, was there any Shiite legal theory work before him? Because we're talking about early Islam.
We don't have a...
Or the seeds preceding him.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the origins and development of Shiite legal theory, or legal theory generally in Islam. So let's talk about legal theory generally in Islam. That story is something which scholars are debating about all the time in terms of the history of Islamic legal theory. So there are those that believe that Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i was the first person to write a work of legal theory.
Usul al-Fiqh.
So he was the first person to write a book of Usul al-Fiqh. You know, most people look at the book that he wrote, the Risala. It's not a work of Usul al-Fiqh. Usul al-Fiqh was later developed. Now, there may be books which are lost between the Shafi'i and the first surviving book, which was written by Abu Bakr al-Jassas, a Hanafi scholar, in the late 10th century. Between Shafi'i, who died in 820 of the Common Era, and Jassas in the late... We have, 150, 200 years in which we don't have many books of Usul al-Fiqh. There may have been Shiite works of Usul al-Fiqh. There was certainly an interest in theoretical issues. Whether there was a book of Usul al-Fiqh is a separate question, but there was certainly interest in theoretical issues. And it seems like the first time that Shiites sat down and wrote a work of Usul al-Fiqh that we would recognize today was through the work of Sheikh Mufid. But this wasn't centuries later after the Sunnis had already developed it. It wasn't that long. I mean, Sheikh Mufid was in the early 11th century of the Common Era. Abu Bakr al-Jassas was like 40, 50 years earlier than him. Most of the works of Sunni legal thought that we have date from the same time as Sheikh Mufid. So my point is, Shiites were part of the early formation of the discipline of Usul al-Fiqh in a way which has not always been recognized.
Definitely not.
And not thought important enough to be recognized. So I think that Sheikh Mufid's book on Islam, of which we probably only have a summary. Okay, we probably lost most of the book. It may turn up one day in a library, but we've got a summary of what the book's contents were, and it looks very like it contained the same discussions, the same sort of issues that were being discussed in some of the Sunni works that have survived, that we do have. So we don't need to be too nervous, if you like. We can be quite forceful in saying that Shiite legal theory was part of this history of Usul al-Fiqh from the earliest recorded periods, And not just 12 Shiite, but also Zaydi Shiite. So Zaydi Shiites also had a tradition of usul al-fiqh, which also can go back to this very early period. So Shiite contributions from the Zaydis or the Twelvers in this early period have largely been ignored. And when people write the history of Islamic legal theory, and that's just one example, if you like, of how the field could be richer, how it could be more comprehensive, and actually it could be better academically, more accurately reflecting the tradition that we're trying to describe by including Shiite sources. And Sheikh Mufid's book on Islamic law, which we have in probably in summary form, called At-Tadhkira fi Usul al-Fiqh. That's recorded as the first book of Shiite legal theory, but it's also got to be recognized as one of the earliest books of Shiite theory that we have, of legal theory generally that we have, as well as just Shiite legal theory, which demonstrates that Shiites were making contributions from the very earliest period.
So 2 questions come to mind now. One of them is controversial. Shiite law is often described as a simple copy-paste job from Sunnis, from Sunni law. Shias couldn't think of anything, Shia scholars didn't really think of anything original. They had the akhbar of the imams, occultation happened, and they had to scramble to put something together.
Yeah.
This is generally what I was taught as an undergraduate, and this is how the story works. And there really isn't anything unique with Shias. No. So why study it? I mean, they just basically just copied what other people were doing because they're a heterodox sect, and they just kind of had to justify themselves because their imam went into occultation. Being facetious, but that is kind of how it is presented. Yeah. That's one thing. And the second thing is what made this this 4th, 5th century so important. So these are 2 questions, but let's start with the first one, which is this perception that, well, Mufid didn't do anything unique. He was just copied what his Sunni colleagues had already thought of. The geniuses had already come, and he just simply, just copied his classmates' notes.
Yeah. No, well, one way in which I have approached that sort of challenge is by thinking, what's unique in Shi'i works of legal theory, and what does it share? What questions does it share with other works of legal theory? And what elements would you say are distinctively Shiite? There are distinctively Shiite elements within the works, which could never have been copied from a Sunni work, for example. They could never have been copied because, for example, the question of consensus of the community, okay? Early Shiite legal thinkers conceived of the consensus of the community not as a proof in itself, but as a mechanism for uncovering the opinion of the imam. If everyone in the community agrees upon an issue, and our imam is in hiding and not manifest, then we know that amongst the people that have agreed on this, the imam must be one of the people that's agreed. So a consensus reveals the imam's position. This is, in the early Shiite legal texts, this is one of the ways they talk about ijma'. No Sunni is ever going to come up with a theory like that. Okay? So this is an element of Shiite legal theory from the very earliest period, which cannot have derived from Sunni works. So what does this reveal? It reveals that Shiites were thinking and incorporating some of their theological principles into their legal thinking at a very early stage. They weren't just copy and pasting, because if they were copy and pasting, then they'd talk about ijma' in the same way that the Sunnis talk about ijma', yes? Yep. They don't talk about it. They talk about it in a specifically Shi'i way. And early Shi'i legal texts, particularly legal texts of theory, of usul al-fiqh, they demonstrate on particular questions, on particular masail, as they're called, distinctive Shi'i answers, which they could not have copied from a Sunni perspective, because the Sunnis, because they're based on theological principles which Sunnis don't hold. So they must have been something which is internally generated within the Shiite tradition. So that's one question. That's one issue that demonstrates that they're not just copy and pasting. The other thing which demonstrates that they're not copy and pasting is the fact that the contacts in the early period between the Shīʿī scholars who were writing Usul al-Fiqh and those who were outside of the Shi'i tradition, such as it was at the time, we know that they were extensive, and we know how they shared material and how they studied together, such that they weren't just copying and pasting. They were also teaching, and the Sunnis were learning from them.
Fascinating.
So now, there are community dynamics, which means that very often you do not admit to having been influenced by someone from outside of your own tradition. It happens, but it's more of a rarity. So when you're writing a work of Usul al-Fiqh in the Shiite tradition, you're not going to say, oh, I took this idea from Sunnis. And when you're writing it in the Sunni tradition, you're not going to say, I took it from Shiites. But I recognize those dynamics in the historical context in which they're occurring. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't exchange and interaction between the two traditions. So you look at discussions of some of the classic questions of Usul al-Fiqh. So the questions such as Khabar al-Wahid. Okay? I'm not sure how many of your listeners know what Khabar al-Wahid is, but the idea in legal theory is that if you have a report from the Imam or from the Prophet in which it's not well attested, there aren't hundreds and hundreds of versions of this report transmitted through hundreds and hundreds of people, it's transmitted through a small number of people. How much can you trust that report? You know, can you rely on it when you're making legal judgments? That was a problem for the Shiites, and it was a problem for the Sunnis. So their discussions around Khabar al-Wahid, you read them and you can see the interaction and exchange of views. The problem was a common problem between Shiites and Sunnis. It wasn't something which was specifically Shiite. Shiites had to come up with a solution to the fact that some of their reports were transmitted by a small number of people. Sunnis had to come up with a solution to the problem that some of the reports which they rely on in their law were transmitted by a small number of people. It's the same intellectual problem, and so the discussions show a huge amount of overlap and sharing of ideas that we can see now when we put the texts next to each other, even though at the time each person in each tradition won't necessarily openly admit to taking something from another source. I mean, you know, you read Hanafi works of fiqh, they don't even acknowledge that they read anything from the Shafi'is or the Malikis or anybody else. You know, and similarly, and in some ways, the Shiite works also don't recognize that they read other works. But we know from reading the way in which they discuss issues, there was an exchange of ideas and a sharing, if you like, of material. There must have been, because otherwise the discussions wouldn't look so similar. They wouldn't cover the same issues. And it certainly wasn't a case of copy and pasting. There may be issues where the Sunnis had a discussion and they influenced the Shiites, and there may have been issues where the Shiites had discussions and they influenced the Sunnis. And part of our task as academics is to sort of like go through the material with a fine tooth comb, working out how they exchanged their ideas and when they might have done it. And that is not a simple task. It's a long-term project. But you won't do it if you think that the Shiites never contributed anything original, that they were somehow doing everything way after the Sunnis had already developed the ideas. I'm not saying that there weren't instances where Shiites read something in a Sunni book and said, "Oh, we could use that," and they use it. But you have to recognize that the process was dialogic and conversational. The records of those conversations are largely lost to us. but we have to be able to read the sources sympathetically so that we can reconstruct them. And if you have that understanding of the historical context, then some of the assertions of an entirely separate and unconnected traditions of Shiism and Sunnism, or traditions within Sunnism or traditions within Shiism, they sort of fall away. Trying to enforce those silos between different traditions becomes much less academically important than understanding the processes of sharing that has gone on. And I think that that's one of the things which, you're beginning to see happen within the field. And I think that there are positive developments. And if I've made a contribution to that, then I think that part of my work has been done in that sense, because I had a whole project on integrating Shiite legal studies into the wider framework of Islamic legal studies. And, some of the postdoctoral scholars that I had on that project have gone on to make significant contributions to doing that work in the subsequent careers.
I have two last questions. Well, one that I already mentioned, which is, what made the 4th and 5th century unique? You mentioned that a few times. What was different about that time than later times, earlier times? What were 2 or 3 factors?
Well, there's certainly a political factor, in the sense that you had quite a rapid changeover of caliphs and sultans and dynasties. So we went through a complicated period of time, and each one left an imprint on the societal makeup. And some of them were highly sympathetic to Shiism. So they institute a sympathy towards Shiite learning within the society, and that survives beyond the dynasty. So we have instances of that. So that's one thing, is that the political context, although it was quite volatile, actually that volatility enabled different groups to flourish simultaneously. It meant that there was not until the invasion of the Mongols do we actually have something which brings a catastrophic end to it. And before that, the Seljuks impose, if you like, a sort of a Sunni rationalism, and that's where you start to have the traditions moving in a more introspective manner.
The 6th century now.
Yeah, so you're talking later. So this period, the arrival of the Seljuks in many ways is the time when Sheikh Tusi decides that he can no longer be part of the Baghdad intellectual milieu because of the oppression which he's suffering. And he has to move to Najaf to set up himself in Najaf as a reaction, if you like, to the oppression. That marks the end, if you like, I think, and the beginning of the traditions becoming more introspective and talking amongst themselves after that. Yeah. And so the reflection, if you like, of what was happening earlier than that is one where there's much more exchange of ideas going on between the communities because the political context allowed it, partly. The Sunni system of the 4 madhabs had not yet been established. That was in the future. And the establishment of the 4 systems was part of the story of the establishment of Sunni orthodoxy. That hadn't happened yet. So that's another thing which makes it unique, that there wasn't yet a fixed notion of what Sunni Islam is going to look like, which meant that there wasn't a fixed notion of what non-Sunni Islam was going to look like. So it survived. That was another factor, if you like, that meant that you could have these exchanges in this early period, in the 3rd and 4th century, which you couldn't have, which became more difficult as time went on, and the political context became more problematic. And then from the 16th century onwards, you had empires which were Sunni and Shiite, the Ottomans and the Safavids, which were at war with each other, which took on a flavour of conflict between the two religious traditions. But the early period, much more complicated than that, where there's sharing of material. So I think that's one of the things which means that that period was special, and understanding it is very important in terms of getting the history right. That it hasn't always been like that, and consequently, it doesn't have to be like that.
Hence the study of intellectual history and Islamic law and the Shia role in that, I think, is so pivotal. Yeah. And, the 1,000-year anniversary of the founding of the House of Najaf, or I think Sheikh Tusi's death, something to do with Sheikh Tusi anyhow. It's coming up soon,
yes.
The millennium, of which we'll be together in Najaf for that next year. Looking at the current situation, all these developments that have gone on, where do you see Shiite law now? I mean, just in terms of, is it dynamic enough to handle what's going on in the world right now? I mean, is there anything unique at all about Shi'i law in terms of the way it handles,
in many
way
ways,
it negotiates
in many ways,
time and space?
In many ways, Shiite law, Shiite legal thought today is more vibrant and receptive to comparative study and the incorporation of new ideas than many of the other legal traditions which are operating today in the Islamic world. Shiite law and Shiite scholars have always had an attitude towards external bodies of knowledge, which is, let's study it, understand it, and try, and if necessary, take on board some of the lessons from it. And you can see that through the history of Shiite intellectual development, in terms of philosophy or medicine, and in law as well. And you're seeing it today in terms of Shiite legal thinkers really grappling with some of the contemporary issues. Now, it's a spectrum. There are extremely traditional people who haven't yet taken on board the fact that the world is changing rapidly. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are thinkers who are, and they're coming up with lots of different answers. And in some sense, the legal discussion today amongst Shiite thinkers is much more imaginative and far-reaching, and in some points risky. They push boundaries, some of these thinkers, in ways which you don't see so often within the Sunni environment. Why? The maintenance of a tradition of ijtihad is one thing, that Shiites have promoted, if you like, the thinking of the jurist, the intellectual reasoning of the jurist to be an important way in which legal thought moves on. That's one thing. But also, I think there's something about the Shiite theological framework in terms of the absence of the imam gives Shiites a space to try and experiment, which has enabled them to come up with interesting ideas, whilst also remaining devotionally committed to the imam as an object of, religious devotion. So that framework, I think, in some ways, that theological framework allows Shiite law to develop and continue developing, making it quite exciting. But like I said, there's a spectrum from the most conservative, which you might say is less accommodative of new ideas and maintains a strict adherence to traditional frameworks, and to the more liberal. I use the term because I haven't got another word for it, but it's working in a sort of in a more open framework. Yeah. And that's what makes it interesting, is that you have this huge spectrum of and it's richer and more vibrant, I think, than you find in many parts of the other parts of the Muslim world.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you
Professor
very much.
Gleave. We appreciate your time.
Thank you to the listeners for managing to get to the end of the podcast, if you're still listening.
Wonderful. So this brings us to the end of our podcast. If you like us, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find the podcast on Spotify, on Apple, on your favorite podcast subscription. And you can go to our website, and if you like our material, think of supporting the Institute. Thank you very much.